All right, so this is the nitty-gritty. Again, this workshop is not creating an export plan per se. Last week I gave you points that you need to add if you're doing an export plan, what you need to make sure and cover as part of your export plan. But these are sections and things that you might integrate into an export plan. So looking beyond me sending pencils to Canada, what is my foreign entry mode? So non-equity modes versus equity modes, there's a few different ways of looking at it. So non-equity modes is I don't have a financial commitment in the country. I don't have sunk dollars into that country. Yeah? Whereas in equity mode, maybe you're doing a joint venture or maybe you have a wholly owned subsidiary, you've got a physical presence in that country. Yeah? So those are two different ways of looking at it. Another way of looking at it are that these two columns in the middle are strategic alliances. So these are areas where you're really reliant and you've got a relationship with a partner overseas, whereas here and here you're not working as closely with a foreign partner. You're pretty much usually making the calls yourself. Yeah? So that's kind of two different ways of looking at it. You have some sort of an alliance, a strategic alliance by a contract, by a joint venture with another party overseas that ties you in, or is this more, it's a wholly owned subsidiary, this is your money, it's sunk overseas, and you're choosing what you want to do exactly. You've got a lot of control over what's happening. Or if you're exporting directly or indirectly, then you're still having a lot of control over the production yourself, all of the control over the production yourself, and then you're bringing it into that foreign market, but you're still very closely tied to your product. Yeah, does that make sense? So within contractual, if you're doing something like a franchising, right, then you are accepting money for someone else to be using your name. So you still have a lot of risk involved because your name is at stake, your reputation is at stake, but someone else is actually sinking those costs in. And if it's a JV, then someone else is sinking in, maybe half of those costs. So again, looking at it as exporting, contractual, like those two columns we saw in the middle, or investment, as in having a wholly owned subsidiary. These are going to be your advantages and disadvantages of each. So none of them is better or worse than another, except for how it works for you within your industry, within your product, within your company. Yeah? So if you're exporting, you do have limited financial risk, and it's a limited time commitment on your part. Yeah. At first, it might not seem that way, but compared to the others, it definitely is. The disadvantages of exporting are that you do have limited exposure into a market. You have a limited control and limited profit. So you're only going to sell as many pencils as Canada is buying from you, or the distributor you're working with in Canada is buying from you. You might not have a whole lot of contact with the customer and not be real sure exactly how they're using your product or what you can do to make your product better or be more appropriate, increase sales in that market. If you have a contractual, then you're working closely with a partner in the country, so you're getting a little bit more maybe information on what's happening. You can get into the market sometimes a lot quicker, and it's still going to limit your time and effort and your financial commitment. But disadvantages are that there's a higher competitive risk. You do have a limited control. Profit can go either way. And investment, as in a wholly owned subsidiary, or you're opening a manufacturing facility overseas, you have the advantage of high profits, virtually unlimited profits, right? There may be rules about you removing your profits from that country or keeping them in that country, But if you're manufacturing there, then you've got so much control over what's going on. And you can definitely reach a higher market penetration point. But it is a high risk. It's a high commitment, etc. Okay, so when we discuss more, there's usually a continuum. Yeah? So a lot of companies will start with indirect exporting, move to direct exporting, and then sometimes, especially within the context of the STEP program that some of you are associated with in the state, we don't really want to discuss foreign production very much because it sounds like the jobs are going overseas, right? But when you pick up something in a computer and it says made in Malaysia on it, is it really made in Malaysia? Right? Where these components are coming from all over the world these days, and there are so many inputs of time, labor, physical components that come from everywhere that it's really difficult to say that one product is actually coming from only one country. So it is something interesting to look at. I used to work in automotive, and so we made rubber hoses and fuel fill assemblies, coolant hoses, etc. So we would make a lot of those components in Michigan. We would make other components in our factories in New York. We would ship them to Mexico, where they would assemble them and add other components, and then they would ship them back to us in the United States. Right? And in the process, we were also purchasing other components from Taiwan and other components from Brazil. So our fuel fill assemblies were really very global assemblies in many ways. So sometimes that's the reality of the situation. Okay, so indirect exporting. You have a third party that is coordinating your market your market entry on your behalf, and they assume that risk. So piggyback marketing. Say you're producing a high-end vodka. Yeah, you're producing a high-end vodka, and you're getting ready to take it international. And down the road, there's somebody who's producing a high-end cognac, and they're already international. Right? They've got a huge piece of the international market. They know that what they're doing a really good job at it. So you go down to your neighbor and you say, hey, I think our products are pretty similar. Would you be interested in selling my vodka in all the places you sell your cognac? Because you already understand it's alcohol, so there's some additional restrictions that take place. There's a lot of cultural things associated with alcohol. You already get that, and I think we'd have a lot of the same customers. Would you be interested? Or maybe vice versa, maybe they approach you. Yeah. And so that other company, you're piggybacking, you're taking advantage of all of their sales team, all of their market knowledge, and they're functioning like your international sales division for you. Right? So they're like, sure, and they just kind of take on that aspect for you. You don't have too much to worry about. It's kind of nice. The disadvantages, we'll look at a little bit more. There are definitely disadvantages because you are not developing a whole lot of knowledge yourself, right? You're just relying on them to do it all for you. You're not really getting your feet wet, you're not jumping in, you're just kind of letting them deal with any issues that come up. So your knowledge and your learning is limited, but you're also, right into the marketplace, taking advantage of what they know, and you can usually penetrate the market a lot quicker. So that's nice. You have a low risk, low commitment. You can get into the market quickly, fairly easily, and you get a little bit of institutional learning. So you can't say there's nothing that you learn, but you're starting little by little to kind of understand what's going on in the international arena. Again, you don't have any control of much of anything, right? So if they are in 30 countries, but they're not in a country that you might be interested in, you're limited to the countries that company is already in, right? So you can't say, yeah, do all of that for me, and you also need to go to Thailand if the company's not in Thailand, right? You can do another marketing plan. You can go into Thailand separately, but you're not going to be able to piggyback into Thailand if there's not already if that company is not already there. Does that make sense? Do you have a question, Joe?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, as a disadvantage, after taking one of the steps on our programs and just getting some basic knowledge, and if you're not knowledgeable about the thing, you might actually have to pay more just because you just don't really know what's going on. I had a company that called and said, listen, I need a tariff number, and they were about to go and pay for a broker to figure out this process. Well, after some of the trainings that I've been through, I realized that the company he was doing business with in an indirect way that was exporting directly, already had a broker. So he was able to go and contact their broker and get the tariff number and export his product and ship directly. So knowledge is actually a disadvantage. If you don't know the whole game and how it's played, then you might be spending more costs because you might not realize that you already have a resource that's available. So, if that makes sense.
I think so. So depending on what country you're looking at, depending on what market you're in, the supply chain and the path to market looks a lot different. Yeah. So sometimes you're a lot more direct, sometimes there's a lot more players in the mix. And I had somebody say to me the other day that they hadn't done business in Mexico before, or Latin America. And they said, I've got all of these intermediaries and these individuals calling me, and they were trying to insert themselves into the process. So instead of just calling a distributor directly, they're like, no, well, I know a distributor, let me do it, right? And so these individuals were kind of trying to take a piece of the pie and insert themselves into the center of the transaction and take a chunk of it, which, if the people are trying to make money in that makes sense. And sometimes there is value added to having another individual or another company facilitate a process for you. But sometimes you can do that directly yourself. Sometimes you can work directly with the distributor or directly with a client and take out that middleman and achieve a higher portion of the profits and be closer to your customer and be a little closer to the market. Is that kind of where you're?
Yeah, they were able to utilize the resources of the company that was actually doing exporting. So that's good thing.
So as I mentioned, poor market feedback. You'd be locked into that company's markets instead of what might potentially be your best markets. So just things to think about. Questions on that, the piggybacking? So another product maybe for indirect exporting. Ooh. Another product you might piggyback, any ideas? Similar products? Maybe your own product, is there something that you think it's a very comparable product that maybe you would be interested in piggybacking?
Well, we kind of do that with some of the Bobcat dealers. We don't really piggyback, but we seek out them as distributors a little bit because it seems like we're a good fit. They're both around the same price ranges and stuff, so it seems to work for us a little bit. In the smaller, in the tree care line, not the industrial.
Okay. Are they competitors of yours?
No.
No. So they're similar products, but not direct competitors.
Correct.
Are you thinking of wanting to use the same
Seems like a lot of
distributors?
the customers that buy their products would buy our products as well.
Perfect. Export management companies. So export management companies are exclusive and they manage the whole process for you. So somebody might knock on your door and say, you are making this awesome food additive, and I want to sell that product for you. And give me what your market standard is 5%, 15%, 30% discount. and I'm going to buy this quantity from you, and I'm going to take it overseas, and I've got all of my people overseas, and we're gonna go from there. And you say, sure, great, go for it, buy it, do it. Usually these companies are exclusive, so they're not representing competitive products to yours. They're selling your product, and they might be selling something that's in a completely different market, completely different industry, I mean. So they're not selling two products that are competing for each other, and tend to be very, where am I headed with this? All right, so they do tend to be very good at what they do. Again, you're locked into their markets, but they know the markets. Like, they're very aware of what's happening. They've got physical presences in overseas markets. Export trading companies, a little bit different. And again, all of these, and I'm hesitating a little bit because all of these, their lines kind of blur. We try to divide them out. But some of these companies do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and sometimes that depends on the market, depends on the product, etc. But export trading companies are non-exclusive, usually. They might be representing a competitor of yours as well. And they may be importing as well as exporting. They've got their fingers in all sorts of different pies. An export commission agent or a broker is somebody who's just going to basically just pass on your order from overseas. They're not going to take physical possession of your product. So in indirect exporting, the third party is coordinating the market entry on your behalf and is assuming the risk. In direct exporting, which is where most of us are headed, the manufacturer is in direct control of the international expansion. So you're a little bit closer to what's going on, you're a little bit closer to your customer. You might be using a foreign distributor or an agent who purchases quantities of your product for distribution, utilizing the marketing and the experience of the manufacturer. So you might have a foreign distributor, but you could still be bringing them to the United States for training. You're still sending your salespeople overseas to make these sales calls with them. You're still involved in follow-up or servicing of your product. So you're working hand in hand in most cases with these foreign distributors. Foreign market subsidiaries is going to be kind of another step beyond that still. And you're going to actually employ marketing staff overseas. So that person is an employee of yours. So when you take on a foreign employee, you're also taking on the employment laws of that country, which when I worked in Mexico, when we had factory workers and we wanted to lay off, we were still required to pay 6 months of salary for those people. So that was something a little bit different than in the United States. That was something we definitely need to be aware of because it was a significant cost that we needed to consider as we were doing these hirings. But if you've got a marketing staff overseas, then that person is probably working in conjunction with your foreign distributor, your foreign agent, to make those sales calls. So the benefits when you get into direct exporting are you do have a lot more control. You are actually out there with the customers, maybe once a year, maybe once a month. Maybe you've got someone over there on a full-time basis. So you're getting a lot more feedback, and you have that possibility of maybe having higher sales because of it. Excuse me. The disadvantages are it's a little bit more of an investment. It might be a little bit more time to market because you are having to do all of that market investigation yourself. You're not relying on somebody else's knowledge that they've already established. And in those cases, you also got a little bit more risk. So this is kind of a continuum. as you commit more resources, and as you, usually with more resources committed, you've got more control and more feedback. So if you're working as an indirect exporter of your product, then you don't have a whole lot of resources involved, but you also don't have that control and feedback. It would be nice to have limited resources and have resources committed and have a lot of feedback and a lot of awareness of what's going on. It's just not very easy to achieve. It's possible to have a lot of resources committed into a market and still not have much control and feedback in what's going on in that market. But that's definitely not where you want to be. But again, as you commit more, as you get more feedback, you're moving more into this direct exporter, and then you might be moving more into a foreign production. You might be moving into a joint venture or something more up here. Does that kind of make it clear? Questions? So as we mentioned before, it can vary a lot in different markets. Yeah. So you might be having a hybrid model or a blended approach. Why would you go with a hybrid or a blended model?
Shared. Oh, yeah, shared. Responsibility.
Okay, so you have less commitment if you're working with a partner overseas that's taking on more of that commitment, right? If you've got like a joint venture or something. But why would you do piggyback marketing in one country, a joint venture in another country, and direct exporting in another country?
Risk management.
Okay.
per country. Whatever's available, I mean, maybe something different available in different countries. I mean, it may not be an option to do a piggyback in one country.
Because of either the way that market is structured in that country, and stepping back from that, it might be structured in a specific way because of administrative reasons, right? So there might be legal reasons that prevent you from doing certain things in different countries. Okay. So in India, I can remember the specifics, but there was a couple of different laws that were recently passed, I think in the fall and then in January, about letting foreign companies into certain segments of the market. So first they couldn't, and then they could, and then they couldn't, right? So have controlling shares of different companies. So you might be able to have a 51% stake in a company in a country, and you might not be able to have that controlling stake. You might not be able to have more than a 30% share in a company overseas. So in that case, you're never going to open your own manufacturing facility because it's not allowed, right? So you've always got to work with a local partner who's always going to have more control than you are because of the way the administration and the legalities in that country are. So, yeah. So the other thing we discussed a little bit was what your short-term and your long-term strategies are. So maybe you're starting out with piggybacking, and as you get more accustomed to a market, you get a little bit more involved. You do direct exporting. Or maybe you start with one product, and as you start to understand the way the business is done, you add a second product, a third product onto that. So if you're actually getting into foreign production, there might be contract manufacturing, which happens a lot, especially in China. You think about that a lot. There might be licensing or just foreign assembly, joint ventures, mixed ventures. We just discussed a little bit. In some companies or in some countries, there is the opportunity for a wholly owned subsidiary, and some there is not. We didn't really discuss yet the adaptation of your product to a market. So they might be using a different voltage right? If you go to Europe, a lot of times you see washing machines that are about this big, right? So if you're selling these washing machines that are these big industrial models that we have in our homes these days in the United States, probably not going to work out real well in an apartment in Madrid or Paris, right? So you might need to adapt your product to the needs, behavior, the purchasing power of your customers. You know, you might have tons of wonderful bells and whistles, but the market you're looking at isn't a market that is used to paying for those bells and whistles or can afford it. So you might be cutting back a little bit and coming up with a more simple model. You might be doing the opposite. You might be adding different features that customers in the United States are not used to, that customers overseas expect. You know? Somebody already mentioned labeling standards earlier, and that's always a big concern. Government standards, so testing requirements, tariffs, non-tariff barriers that need to be considered. And those are all put together because some things kind of cross and become non-tariff barriers, even though they're considered testing requirements. So you've got like this CE mark in Europe, right? Which, you know, they say it's a testing standard. Some people might say they're just trying to create more barriers to entry for foreign companies into Europe. Depends how you want to look at it. We mentioned a lot of these resources last week, the STEP program, the U.S. Export Assistance Centers. So the one that serves this area is Grand Rapids. And they have district, does anyone know what a district export council is? The DEX. Okay, so there are international business professionals. Frequently, it's a mix of lawyers, bankers, sometimes private service providers, sometimes, usually, individuals who work for large international firms. And they meet usually quarterly, it just depends. They are appointed by Congress, and I don't know if it's Congress or the Department of Commerce. Maybe they're just appointed by the Department of Commerce. But it is their job to assist new to export companies. So maybe you're really interested in South Africa. You're able to contact the U.S. Export Assistance Center in Grand Rapids and say, I'm really interested in South Africa. Can you put me in touch with somebody who's doing business there? And then they can. Or maybe you are just starting to export and you aren't really sure about registering your name overseas, or maybe your patent, right? And then you can usually put you in touch with a lawyer who can give you some pretty standard advice. And then if you need to go in a little bit more in depth, you know who to go to and what sorts of things you need to consider when you're working with a lawyer. You know, because those are all considerations. I know I talk to companies and they're just like, oh, I don't want to have to deal with lawyers, right? But it's really way too easy to get into an overseas market and then find out somebody else is using your name, using your logo, using your product, because you've got to file. In most countries, it's first to file. So if somebody files your logo in their country, then they have control of it in that country, pretty much. Yeah. So you need to, before you enter the market, you need to think about all of these things. So in addition to that, so these district export councils, these are fantastic. The USACs also will give you one-on-one export counseling. They'll do primary market research for you. I mentioned before, I have students that will do that for you, and you guys already are gaining some of those tools to begin to do that yourselves. They do a Gold Key business-to-business matching service, which is awesome for the price. I think it's $600 perhaps. But if you call up the Department of Commerce, you call up your USAC, and say, I am heading to France in 2 months, and I need to meet with companies that sell office furniture. What they will do is set up 3 to 4 appointments in a single day for you to meet with companies that sell office furniture in France. It's a pretty nice deal, right? So you can sit down with them, and they'll pre-scan these companies to make sure they're legit, and they'll give you their contact, and you can either meet with them at one of the embassy offices abroad, or they will set up an office space for you to sit down and meet with those companies. And then you can actually do 2 days, so 6 to 8 companies. I think the second day is like $300 or something. So it's very affordable for what you're getting. And it's called their Gold Key Business to Business Matching. International company profiles. So maybe you get a call from, let's use Nigeria, right? You get a call from Nigeria. And they say, yeah, your product is great. I want to sell so many of them, right? Send me a bunch of them. And you're like, who are you? And where are you coming from? So if you bring that information on that company to the Department of Commerce, or call Kendra Coe at the USAC in Grand Rapids, she can have her counterparts do a background search on that company. Find out what their corporate history is, find out what their credit rating is, find out if they're legitimate. And there is a fee for that service. Usually the fees that are charged by the Department of Commerce are a lot less than you have for private companies, but it just depends on what your interest is. Sometimes you get better service from a private company, sometimes you do from the Department of Commerce. Overall, I've heard really great things about the Department of Commerce services from companies that have worked with them. Advocacy services for U.S. firms bidding on foreign government tenders. So if you're selling uniforms and you want to sell them into Saudi Arabia, you can get some assistance with that from the Department of Commerce. If you have a trade dispute, in the United States, it's a lot easier to take someone to court than it is somebody who is overseas, right? But you do have the assistance of the Department of Commerce and the U.S. government if you do have disputes with overseas companies.